Mr. Derek Veenhoff, who's better known as Deek.
Drinking liquor with DJ Deek, we out laughing.
Yo, Deek.
Okay, guys, welcome back to the show. I'm here today with Lalo Dagach. Welcome, Lalo.
Hey, and thanks for pronouncing my name correctly.
Did I say it right? Okay, great.
Yeah, Lalo. Yeah, a lot of people say Lalo or some other
Lalo.
variation. Yeah.
Is there any other like figure or celebrity named Lalo? Or I don't think I've heard that.
The only other Lalo that I saw recently from like the entertainment world was, I think, the music composer to Enter the Dragon was a Lalo.
Oh, interesting.
That's
Bruce Lee? Or sorry, that's the Jet Li movie?
No, Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee. Yeah.
Oh, Bruce Lee. Okay.
Yeah, if you look in the opening credits there where Bruce Lee's walking around, there's a Lalo in there. Yeah, music
but it's
composer.
not you. Okay.
Yeah.
So why don't we give people a little bit of your background? I initially got into you in your Twitter account and your podcast, I think by way of the Secular Jihadists. I think that was the connection. So, but why don't you give people maybe where you come from, your background, and sort of the areas of study that you've been into over your life?
Sure, it's a lot, but I'll try to summarize it as quick as I can. So I was born in the United States, so I don't speak with an accent, but I live in Chile, Santiago, Chile. I moved here from Los Angeles with my parents, who were both Chilean immigrants, in 1994 to Chile. I didn't speak Spanish when I got here, and I went to school here. Then I moved back to the United States on my own to study film in UC Santa Barbara, where I got my undergraduate. Then I moved to Korea, went to university in Yonsei University in Seoul. I also worked in Tokyo for a while, also lived in Hong Kong for a little bit, and then came back to Chile in 2009, where I got my master's in international relations. And I got into the online world at the beginning of 2015. Yeah, that's when I started tweeting.
Time.
Yeah. So I was brought up without any religion, not brought up an atheist, just brought up without religion. My parents weren't religious, and I was always interested in religion, which for an atheist who's been a lifelong atheist, that's kind of rare. I notice everyone in the atheist community comes from a religious background, and I think because I come from the polar opposite. It's interesting to me because religious people are kind of this weird phenomenon where I didn't really get it.
Yeah.
Especially coming not just from religious parents, but my father's a physicist, my brother's a physicist, my grandfather's a physicist, lots of Palestinian physicists in my family. So my father is of Palestinian background, by the way. And so I got into international politics, wanted to start talking about religion and international relations surrounding religion, especially around Islam. And I started talking on Twitter, did some videos, some podcasts, and did pretty well, especially considering the short period of time I was doing it. There's a lot I've been wanting to express through the online world. Besides my ideas, I think my background is something that I would like to put out there, not for an identity politics kind of reason, but just because people are not very aware of the community I come from, which is Palestinian community of Chile. So you're probably, if somebody said they're Palestinian American, that would make a lot of sense to somebody. But if they say they're Palestinian Chilean, that would sound a bit odd. But there's actually more than about 3 times the size of the Palestinian community in Chile than there is in the United States.
Right.
It's the largest Palestinian community outside the Middle East, and it's the 4th largest in the world. And I mean, even if you looked at other numbers, like the entire Arab community, not Palestinian, Arab community of all the UK is about 500,000. The entire Arab community of Australia is about 500,000. There's about 1 million Palestinians just in Chile. And there's much more than that if you just count all the other Arab community, which is like Lebanese and Syrian mostly. And another interesting characteristic of the Palestinian community and the Arab community almost entirely of Chile is that practically 0% are Muslim. which
They're
is
Christian.
something of Christian background, So they a lot of them were Orthodox Christian. A lot of them have converted to Catholicism. But you'll find some of the biggest Arab communities in diaspora in the world in Latin America. They're in Venezuela, they're in Argentina, they're in Brazil. Like, let's say just the Lebanese community, a diaspora. There's like 12 million people just of Lebanese, not Arab, just Lebanese community in Brazil. Right. And that just way outweighs any other Arab community that you'll find in the United States or Europe. But how often do you hear about Arabs in Latin America versus like Arab communities in the United States or in Europe? Right?
Well, that, and then even just Chile in general, which was one of the things I wanted to get into a bit with you, is in the news you don't hear about it much at all. I, as a Canadian, 30-year-old Canadian dude, don't know much about the country. I had to do a little bit of reading up, and I didn't realize that it was so I don't know if you would call it progressive, but as far as economics and all that, it's developed very highly for Latin America.
Extremely developed. That's something I got to observe when I moved to Chile and saw how the development of the country. And economically, it's been thriving. It's by far the best economy in all of Latin America by far. Its purpose now for like the country that it's asking itself politically is how to become among like first world countries. It's part of there's an organization of just like first world developed countries, which it's a part of, but it still kind of needs to some kick forward in a lot of economic issues. But it's doing very well. We've been getting a lot of immigration from countries like Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, which I know in the United States and Europe is a very contentious issue, immigration. But for Chile, which is such a thriving economy, it's actually something that people see very positively because it's a small population. It's not a big country, but considering its population of only 17 million, it's relatively underpopulated. And so, and a lot, and also very interesting aspect that I recently heard about is that the average Venezuelan immigrant who has come to Chile in the last 3 years or so has a higher level of education than the average Chilean, which is a very interesting aspect. So there's a lot of very educated people from Latin America moving here because they're coming for not necessary labor jobs. Because Venezuela's economy is so bad, people even who studied like have a master's in engineering, which I've met, can't get any kind of decent job in Venezuela because there's just no jobs. So very highly educated people are coming to Chile. So
sidebar? What is the situation in Venezuela as of very late? I know a couple months back I saw some news about how hard things were getting there. But is there any? What's the latest update there? Is it still turmoil?
It's a lot of people pay attention to Venezuela in the last like couple of years. I've been following what's been happening in Venezuela since around 2009. It was one of my focuses when I started studying international relations. I was very interested in Chavez. What's happening in Venezuela did not start 2 years ago. It didn't start 5 years ago. It didn't start 10 years ago. It started the day Chavez took over.
Sure.
And it's been getting progressively worse. When he first started off, there's a little bump in the economy, which is typical. If you study any communist country, any at all, doesn't matter which one it is, you'll find that within the first 2 to 4 years, there's a surge in the economy. That's because the communist parties take over everything. They take over the industries. They take over the farming lands. They take over resources of water and electricity and so forth. And so they redistribute that. So it's like they take wealth, they redistribute it. It's very good for a couple of years. But this is like taking out a bunch of credit cards and saying I'm rich, right? It's like, yes, you are rich for right now.
For now, yeah.
Right, but what happens in 10 years? Like, what are you going to live off of? And the problem is when countries like this take wealth, redistribute it, it's easy to spend wealth. It's difficult to create wealth, which is what Chile has done progressively. That's why the economy of Chile has gotten better. It's invested well into industry and development. Now, I know a lot of people on the left will say it's like the problem is not socialism. The problem is U.S. sanctions. Nonsense. The problem is very left-wing, not socialism itself, but very, very far left-wing socialism, practically communism, really communism. Even the banner over which Chavez was pushing his project of economics was based on Cuba. It's not socialism. It's hard. It's very, very far left.
Straight up communism. Yeah.
Straight up communism. And even, when you study how the economics is working, they're literally like just making even income for workers from like janitors to CEOs in any company. So it's just communism. That's not how socialist Northern Europe works, right? It's that's
which are like mixed economies. Is that the correct term to use for the Scandinavian?
You could call it that. It's it's leans more towards capitalism, really, but then there's a lot of socialist institutions, which you could call like healthcare would be a socialist institution, right? Education would be a socialist institution if it's free, right? Free in the sense that you don't pay for it out of pocket, but you pay for it through taxes. The tax margin in those countries is very high. However, that's what the left wing would say. It's not so, the problem is not socialism. It's an American sanction. Nonsense. It's the problem is that their own economic plan is just garbage. Mm-hmm. However, I would say to the right wing who just tweet, look what socialism built, right? And in Venezuela, they use this as an excuse to say, oh, we shouldn't, this is why we can't have free healthcare in the United States. Yeah. Now, just so you know, Chile, which is the most thriving economy, has a socialist healthcare system, right? It has a lot of socialist institutions, but it can have that because it focuses on developing capital, right? And it's also been using very wisely its natural resources, such as copper mines and such.
They have lithium.
They have lithium, but mostly it's really copper mines in Chile, which they mine, and also it helps the fact that it's not too rich, because the problem in Venezuela is like they're overtly rich from the oil, and that causes
gas there in Venezuela is like what, 2 cents a liter, or what is it?
I actually think that's not the case anymore. There was a time where they were just giving away the oil. I heard now that's changed, and because they can't afford it. Yeah. And also there's a problem that the oil in Venezuela, it's the richest oil country in the world, but it's a very crude kind of oil that requires processing. They don't process it themselves. They sell crude to places like the United States, and then it gets processed.
Oh, right? Interesting. Okay.
So you can't just put into a car how they have it, right?
So what your pinned tweet on your Twitter is, some believe 1984 is a problem that can be solved with Animal Farm. So now, full disclosure, I've never read either books. I am familiar with their place in culture and sort of the gist behind them, but could you elaborate on that tweet and the meaning behind that? And why is your pinned tweet?
So it's my pinned tweet because I think it's a really brilliant quote. Pat myself on the back. I'm amazing. But I made that my pinned tweet, and I thought about that, how to formulate that idea for quite a while before I even tweeted it. But it's because a lot of people look to 1984 as almost being synonymous with fascism, right? Mm-hmm. I remember there was like a surge in the sales of 1984, the book, when Trump became president, right? Oh, everybody kind of sees 1984 in any political party or person they don't like almost.
Yeah.
And, you could see some truth in there's a little bit of fascism in every kind of political system, right? There's a little imposition on people. But I think there's a lot of people on the left in the West who see fascism as a very big problem. They use the word, the mantra and the manifesto of 1984 to express how they feel towards fascism. However, they failed to read Animal Farm by George Orwell, which is also a brilliant book. I think it's better, actually, than 1984. And Animal Farm is, I would consider the definitive book to explain why communism doesn't work. And I think a lot of these people who invoke 1984 forget to and use 1984 as an example towards how right-wing fascism is very dangerous, forget that the same person wrote a book about how communism is very dangerous. And I think they see like the utopia that some want to create with fascism, and they say, no, the solution is communism. So you could change the words of my tweet and say, some want to think fascism is a problem that could be solved with communism. And I simply changed the words of these books that explain the dangers of both, and said, the people see the 1984 as a problem that can be solved with Animal Farm.
Right.
Like
do you think
not all animals are equal, but all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, kind of thing.
Right. Okay. Do you think that all people that have sort of a communist outlook per se know that they have a communist outlook? Does that make sense? Like, do you think some people have certain political leanings and feelings that they're not quite sure? Maybe they're not educated enough, or they don't actually know the repercussions, or they don't know what it actually is that they're saying and believing. Does that make any sense?
I think that would depend on the person, but I know for a fact there are people who, no matter what you put in front of them, they are so invested in the belief towards communism, there's nothing you could show them to deviate from that belief. People sometimes say communism is a religion. It's not a religion, it's an economic system. But there are people who believe in it as profoundly as religion, which is different. Yeah. And the problem with saying like there's some, if you just educated people enough, you just showed them what was the problem with communism, they'd understand. But the problem is, I have seen communist political leaders in Chile, for example. And these are not people I call communist. These are people of the Communist Party. You actually don't have an official Communist Party in the United States. We have a Communist Party in Chile. It's not an accusation. This is what they're called. Okay, so
I think in Canada we have one, though. Yeah. I'm pretty sure we do.
Really?
I'm pretty sure.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Right yeah, we do. It's the Communist Party of Canada.
It's a bit bigger in Latin America. It's not so in Chile. It's pretty small. It's smaller than you'd find some other places, right. But they're still there. And I know that some of these political leaders who are communist make trips to places like Cuba, and they see what's happening in Cuba. Doesn't faze them. They say, like, Fidel Castro is the greatest leader. This is when he was alive. They met him. Yeah. Is the greatest leader in all of Latin America, an example for all of us to follow. And I really think, as much as I have studied a lot of the dangers of religion, studying places like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, even places that are extremely oppressive against people, being a person who has studied places like North Korea, and I've been to the JSA, I've been to the DMZ, I speak Korean, and I've studied a lot about North Korea, and nothing comes close to parallel of the mind control and oppressiveness of North Korea. So I think it even outweighs the dangers of religion in a lot of cases.
But maybe that's a good jumping off point to jump into North Korea. I don't know if you watched the video today of Trump passing into North Korea.
Yeah, that's just a show. Nothing's
just a show, right? That's kind of my feeling on it too. From both ends, though. From both of their.
So both ends, but who does it really benefit?
Right.
How does that benefit the West or the United States? What are we getting out of it?
Yeah, I don't. To play devil's advocate with people, I guess what they're saying is, like you had Elizabeth Warren tweet, this is we should not be doing that. We should be doing measured diplomacy and this. And then some supporters of Trump will say, look, this is measured diplomacy. It's shaking hands. It's I don't. Well, yeah, like what is it supposed to accomplish really?
So I think even a lot of people who are anti-North Korea, people on the right wing who maybe don't like North Korea, I really think even those people, very few people understand how terrible and evil North Korea is. I really always get the impression very, very, very few people understand what North Korea is. It puts Nazism as almost a joke. They don't come close. This is like Nazism, and Hitler is the boogeyman of Hollywood that every every movie, like, oh, the Nazis are coming. The Nazis are coming. It doesn't. There's literally, you could look this up if you Googled it. There was a North Korean refugee who was in concentration camp and who was giving a testimony to some international court. And the judge who was hearing his testimony was a Jewish Holocaust survivor. Okay? Jewish Holocaust survivor. After hearing this testimony of this North Korean escapee from a concentration camp, the Jewish Holocaust survivor judge said, what's happening in this camp sounds worse than anything that I experienced in the Holocaust. And when you're dealing with a country like that, you can't just play patty cake. You can't just like show up on the border and say like, oh, we're shaking hands. The problem with the diplomacy that Trump is showing is the kind of diplomacy you would want for two countries that have a history of antagonism. But essentially, that's all that's wrong. All that's wrong between the two is like you and me don't get along.
Like Japan or something.
Have you ever had a fight with a friend and the only problem between you two is the fight? Like you just got to shake hands and it'll be done.
Right.
Right. In situations like that, I understand. Like, yeah, it'd be good if the United States just shake hands, get over that fight, that old beef you had. There's countries like this, for example. I could give you an example. Korea, Japan.
Okay.
Korea, Japan have a lot of antagonism between each other, a lot of hatred. I experienced it. I saw it myself when I was living in these countries. How the racism between them, the contentious history. Japan colonized Korea. They were very oppressive. They had enslavement camps. I don't know if you've heard, there were islands where literally just rape camps of what were called comfort women, where they just had Korean women there for soldiers to come and just rape. That's and this is in recent history. There are people alive who remember this, right?
This is in the 1900s, like
1920s, 1930s that they were colonized there. That there's nothing happening between them now like that. This is history. This is, and there's a lot of times where they have opened the door, shaken hands, and say like we need to establish better relations. Great. That's not the case of North Korea. It's not just a beef. North Korea has the worst concentration camps right now in the world. The worst oppression of people. And I've posted this in the past. You look at every single metric of freedom in the world, no matter what it is: access to information, access to books, access to the internet, freedom of journalism, freedom of expression. Literally, they rank #1 on slavery in the world.
Yeah,
#1. This is the most evil country. And I would say not just in the world, but in history. In history, should we be shaking their hand with nothing to show for it?
Right.
So I ask, okay, Trump goes to the border and he shakes Kim Jong-un's hand. Why? Yeah. Answer me that. Why? Well, it's to improve relations. Why should you improve relations? Why? Why do you want to have good relations with a country like that? Yeah. What is it? Who's getting any? Are we getting anything out of this? Are the Korean people getting anything out of this? Because, and another thing, let me teach you something I've learned from international politics and history.
Yeah.
We in the West praise democracy. We love it. We think it's the best form of government we have ever found. And you know what's true? It is. It's nice that we can control the power individuals have over us, right? You can, in the United States, for example, you can be president for 4 years. You can be president for another 4 years, maybe if we vote for you. But then that's it. You're president for 8 years, then you're done. Because we don't want you to take too much control over our lives. We don't want you to take too much power, right? Checks and balances, as they love to say, right? Great. Division of powers. Dictatorships, though, they have an advantage. And it's not just the power they have over their people. There's actually a logical advantage that we miss out on in the West. A good advantage. And that's wisdom of leadership that they have. Because a dictator is a dictator for life. and then his son is a dictator, and they
Right.
have the experience
Yes.
of a lifetime of leadership and dealing with other people. North Korea, remember, Kim Jong-un, is his father Kim Jong-il, his father, Kim Il-sung, they and all the generals around them, they have been leaders forever.
Forever. Yeah.
Forever. Trump has been a leader for a year. He was never in politics before. He didn't know anything about history. He didn't know anything about North Korea.
Right.
Kim Jong-un was trained and studied from the day of birth to be a leader. He has people around him who have, since they were children, they have been leaders. They know how to. They know exactly how to toy with international politics. We think this is something that I have learned that very few people understand. North Koreans are not stupid. We look at them, we laugh because they make all these outlandish statements and nonsense. They know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly between like the master of diplomacy and negotiation between Kim Jong-un and Trump. Yeah. Trust me, Trump has got nothing on the North Koreans. North Koreans know exactly what they're doing. And they know like Trump wants to be popular. He's up for re-elections. Kim Jong-un is not up for re-elections anytime soon. Right? There is no re-elections for him. For them, it's they don't need the legitimacy of their own country. What is that what they need? They don't care. They need the legitimacy of who? The world's foreign leaders. They want to be integrated into the world politics without giving anything. They don't want to give anything up. They want to keep all the control, all the oppression, all their nuclear weapons. In fact, they want to grow their nuclear armament, but they want to do commerce, do everything, but just be a horrible country. And that's and Trump is giving it to them.
Right.
Great. So explain to me, what is the upside for the West there? What is the upside for? Is there any upside other than for the government of North Korea for this?
Right.
I don't see it. And look, it could be that Trump, if he's some kind of brilliant strategist, is gonna take a step afterwards, after all this, to actually ask for something tangible, real, that's important, which would either be an improvement on human rights in North Korea, or a reduction in their nuclear armament. Great. If that happens, great. I don't see it happening because the North Koreans are just too smart at this. They know how to play this game. They know that Trump is just up for re-elections. Like there's already debates going on. They know that. They know, this guy wants something. What does he want? What can we give him? Oh, he wants to play the hero. He wants his Nobel Peace Prize that the Obama got. Okay, let's make him look like he solved us.
Yeah.
Right? As the Trump fans say, he solved the North Korean problem. What did he solve? Total mystery. But he shook his hand. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. And then what can we get out of that situation?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It makes sense, and I think it all fits into the Trump narcissism kind of thing. That's for me. I'm a bit of a centrist, and I have a close friend that's a big Trump supporter, more like nominally than anything else. Like he just thinks it's fun to kind of support him, and I see the same thing that you were describing. Just a lot of show for every move, basically.
On principle, I hate all politicians. On principle, I support nobody. There's some people I hate less than others, but I to me, this whole new kind of dynamic from the public of actually treating politicians like superstars who they love, I think is very bizarre. I come from the 90s, right? When I was a teenager, we hated all politicians on principle, right? Like George Carlin, like, oh, you all suck, you're all corrupt, you're all liars.
Yes.
And I've never seen anything to counter that belief. They are all liars, they're all corrupt.
Except they're all crooks except for the one that we support, because they're gonna come in and change.
So don't support any of them, right? Just support some less than others. That's my philosophy.
Maybe we can jump to a little bit of the Democratic debate stuff. And speaking of concentration camps, what are your thoughts and feelings on the rhetoric now about the detention centers or concentration camps in the U.S. for the illegal immigrants coming over? Do you see that as just a lot of rhetoric, or what are the real issues there that could be solved and such?
Yeah, you're asking me a lot of stuff about recent American politics, and I've been really out of it. I didn't see the debates. I've been concentrating a lot on other issues that I'm studying. For example, right now I'm studying Islamic communities in Latin America.
Okay.
So I've kind of moved away from American politics especially national politics,
Yeah.
and moved more into international politics, especially around Islam.
So what about more generally then, like just on immigration from Latin America to the U.S.? Like one question I thought of earlier, but I'm not sure if
Mhm.
it's an ignorant question, is why don't some people migrate to other Latin American countries? Is that just more
Oh, they
difficult
do.
even? Oh, they
Oh, they
okay.
do.
So
Yeah,
like
sure.
what's with people just crossing the Rio? Like there's this again, very, very recent, but there's El Salvador man and his daughter. There's a photo of them drowned in the Rio, and a Canadian cartoonist, just got fired for doing a depiction of Trump sort of playing golf over them or something. Like, he doesn't care about
Mm.
immigrants, that sentiment, and it does make you think like what are these people escaping? Obviously the narco stuff and just the general violence down there. But me not knowing much about Latin America, I think like so they do. You said they do migrate to other Latin
Well,
American countries as well.
I mean, even when you say Latin America, I mean, you're talking about Central America,
Okay.
right? Mostly. I mean, the main countries that people from Venezuela are moving to is Colombia, then Peru and Chile. So there's a lot of uh, Latino migration. I mean, every day I see more people coming from Haiti, Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, Argentina. Argentina's economy is also horrendous, by the way. But in the United States, I think the problem is there seems to be a growing sense of absolutism in people's point of view.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's this growing belief that if you believe in something, there's no exceptions to the rule. Either like now on immigration, now there's talk of like it wasn't up until like I think 2 or 3 years ago I'd even heard the term open borders.
Yeah.
Where there's just free flow of people. That's it. And on immediately it sounds like an absurd joke to me as a person who studies international politics. That would never work anywhere. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Right? Like there's no borders. There's
I
no
think
control.
that's generally used as an attack against Democrats from the right, and I think most
Right.
Democrats say, "Hey, no Democrat says that." They just compare their
Well,
policy wishes
yeah,
to
I
open
even
borders.
hear a lot of kind of, center left and even center right Republicans and Democrats talking more moderately that they believe in immigration, but legal immigration. But I think the public is getting very absolutist, right? And especially thanks to social media, it's the craziest voices that get put forward. Nobody wants to talk to a person who's very moderate about their beliefs on social media. You only get somewhere by being very crazy and very fringe. So there's not much more I could say on the problem of immigration other than, I agree with that. I think there's, you can have a very moderate level of immigration, and I believe in illegal immigration. As far as the ICE and those detention centers,
Yeah.
I would say it sounds like from what I've read that those detention centers have had a lot of those problems for a lot longer than Trump has been president.
Yeah.
And it seems like it kind of, as a person who doesn't even like Trump at all, I find that to be very, very hypocritical from the left when they start talking about a problem being a problem when Republicans start doing it. And I don't think that's a good thing. For example, I remember when Trump became president, suddenly all the Democrats started saying we need to eliminate the electoral college because he had
because
not
it didn't
won
help them. Yeah.
because they had not won the popular vote. But wait, you're only saying this now because you lost? That's not a reason to change a system, right? You can want to change the system, but you can't be just because you lost the flipping of the coin, right? So I
That's
find
similar here in
that's
Canada.
happening.
People are upset with the voting system. Like there should be a proportional representation, but there's certain political commentators that I've listened. I used to be for that as well, and then I've listened to people explain it a certain way that, no, there is reasons behind current systems. Just because it didn't help you or that kind of thing is not a great reason to abolish a system. There's usually some underlying reasons for having something like that.
I'll tell you one thing. Like I think about the current Democratic debates, which I didn't watch the debate, but I made a comment to a friend that they thought was funny, and I made it probably more than half seriously. Is that I really hope somebody like Joe Biden wins, because I would be so happy to go back to straight white old guy is total establishment becoming president again.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
compared to what there is now, like establishment from like crusty old white men sounds amazing. Sounds like let's go back. Like we need to go back to just the middle at this point, because we are
Yes.
so far away from like going really over the top progressive that like establishment sounds like a step forward at this point.
Oh man. Okay, so well, now that you mentioned Islamic communities in, did you say South American countries or just other?
For now, I'm studying them in South America. Yeah.
Okay, we can jump into that a little bit. It's interesting, just to give people more of an idea of like why I enjoy your tweets so much. You had this one tweet recently that was something about Western or white people stealing things, and you had something about the Kaaba that actually might have been stolen. And
The
could
Kaaba.
you,
Yeah.
what is the story behind that being a stolen
Yeah.
object?
Well, as a person who's very critical of religion, I do think it's very important to study what you're critical of. And I'm very critical of Islam, but I do enjoy reading about it. It's very fascinating. So the Kaaba, which is the holiest site for Islam, is it the holiest? It is the holiest site, I think.
In Mecca, is that where it is? Or
It is in Mecca,
Yeah.
where people go for Hajj. And the Kaaba itself is kind of a house structure underneath this black veil. It's believed it was the home of Old Testament biblical figures, because a lot of the early Old Testament mythology is part of Islam. But the Kaaba was not built by Muhammad and his followers. It existed prior to that, and they appropriated it. It was the Kaaba was a place where pilgrims migrated of many different religions, and it contained objects of various religions. So it was a pilgrimage point for them. And the Mecca itself was a very kind of commercial, lucrative place, because you would get pilgrimage, right? You would get people who would come and pay and trade. It's like basically like why touristy places, get money, right? Same principle. But it was when it was appropriated by Islam, the kind of the story behind it changed. They said, no, this was the home of Abraham, and so it was literally appropriated due to Muslim Arab colonialism. You could you want to say imperialism or whatever you wanted to say,
right?
But and this is very well known. This is in books that I've read on Islam from Islamic scholars and everything. It's not all Muslims know this if they've studied. And so what was in my tweet? Somebody was talking about like colonialism appropriating something.
Yeah, something. I don't know what the specific example was, but yeah, there's something about that.
So, but I thought, I believe the person who tweeted it was Muslim, and then I made the point that, well, there's a lot of appropriation of property and goods when it comes to historical colonialism and imperialism.
Yeah.
For example, the Kaaba, and I said, like, are Muslims willing to give this up? Considering that, right, give it back to its original owners or something. It's kind of it's an absurd thing kind of to do at this point in history. And I think in the example, it was so far back in history that they were talking about, centuries back, kind of colonialism, that if we're talking about giving back, property or objects or whatever, historically, are Muslims going to give up the territory and the objects that has been appropriated due to?
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, then they kind of, it's no, just the white people. You got to give everything back. Right.
Another random point about race and religion. Not only yourself has brought this up. It's obviously also a known fact, but the fact that there's more Asian Muslims than there are Arab Muslims, for example. Just a random numbers thing that a lot of people.
Number? Is it more Asian than? See,
I don't know. So.
I don't know if that's exactly true. You might be right, because what you might be referring to is that the most populated countries are mostly Asian. For example, Indonesia, India, Pakistan are some of the most populated countries of Muslims. I don't know if all of them
Okay.
together.
That,
I
okay,
don't know
that
if
makes
all of them
sense.
together actually counter the amount of Muslims you'll find all across MENA, Middle East, and Northern Africa.
Okay.
So I don't know if all those countries together, the sum of them, is still less than Asia. But it is, there is a typical reference that, you know, it's the most populated countries in the world of Muslims are not in the Middle East; they're in Asia.
Right, like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh,
Yeah,
Indonesia. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
India is among the top, for example, which is something that kind of throws people off.
And that's just sheer
Right.
numbers, but yeah, but it's just an interesting fact for some
Without
people
without
who,
looking at your computer, how many Muslim majority countries in the world are there?
how many Muslim majority countries
How many Muslim majority countries are there in the world?
in the world? So how many countries total are there? 300 and something?
There's about 192 some countries about.
Okay. I was thinking of bones in the body or something. um, there's got to be at least 50.
You're really close, 53. Almost everybody says
Wow.
around like 16 or something.
Oh,
Good for you.
I'm pretty good.
You got really cool. You're the only person that got that close, actually.
And I
Good
swear
for
I
you.
did not Google that.
Good. That's good. A lot of people undercut how many Muslim majority countries there are.
Yeah.
And that's not counting the Muslim minority communities around the world. There's a lot of Muslim majority. They make up a quarter of all the countries in the world. And I think I consider that a very important factor when talking about Islam, because there is such a plethora of cultures and nationalities and languages that when people just start talking about like Muslims in Europe, right? It's and just say there's a problem with Muslims and there's a problem with their culture and et cetera, et cetera. It's like, well, you got to be more specific than that.
For sure.
And I find, for example, one of the main topics people talk about Islam in Europe is the UK, for example.
Yep.
Now, to just talk about that there's a problem with Muslims in the UK is very misleading and very ignorant thing to say, because almost the entire Muslim population of the UK is divided between mostly Pakistanis and Bangladeshis. Arabs from any nationality make less than 7%. All of Muslims, not the country, of just among Muslims, only like among them, less than 7% is Arab. Now, so they're only from a few, like a couple countries, Pakistan and Bangladesh, and that's Asian, right? They're like essentially Indian ethnically, right? Desi, what it's called.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when people say, "Oh, well, we're having a problem of Muslim migration," you are not going to have the same cultural problems from if you got 5 million Moroccans than 5 million Pakistanis.
Right.
Way over half of Pakistan is illiterate. Very poor country. You're not hearing on the news from around the world really hardcore terrorism happening from Moroccan terrorists. Mm-hmm. Very rarely you're going to find in the United States, of all the terrorist attacks from Muslims, are going to be Iranian, young Iranians. Very rarely. You might be able to find
a couple hijackers were from Morocco, no? Or one of them? I think one of them from 9/11 was from Morocco.
Could be, but it's I'm not saying
just
it's impossible. I'm just saying it's rare. I'm saying there's some countries that's going to be more predominant than others, right? And there are cultural reasons, there's economic reasons, and these are people who are very different. For example, when you're talking about Pakistan, they don't speak Arabic. It's not, even if you look, if you went to the Wikipedia page of Pakistan and you saw languages, you would see Urdu and every following language under that. Arabic is on the list. It wouldn't make 8th on their list. Now, that's a very big difference when you have people practicing a religion. They can't read the holy book. They can't understand what the religion is about versus another culture. These are very big factors. And Pakistan does have a very different culture from, let's say, Saudi Arabia or Syria, right? These are things you cannot take out of account.
So anytime anybody mentions Muslims in general, you're not being specific enough, essentially, depending on the context of the conversation.
Let's say we were talking about a subject, and I started saying, well, there's a lot of problems with Christians in my country. And you asked me, oh, really? What's the problem? Well, these Christians, they keep talking about Joseph Smith and, And then I keep describing how these people who follow Joseph Smith and their practices, and how they're wearing this magic underwear. These Christians, they come here, they're talking about Joseph Smith. They're wearing. There's a big problem with Christians. You would probably tell me you should probably be more specific to Mormons. Right. You would probably say that to me, right? And you would think that that's a very important distinction to make. You're not having a problem with Catholics, obviously, or Anglicans. You're having a very specific problem to Mormons. So that dynamic of the importance you would give to you're talking about Mormons, people don't do that with Islam. I find that very negative. And when I say that people don't do this would be something that I even find that is not being done on podcasts as big as even Sam Harris's podcast. I would encourage, as a fan of Sam Harris.
Sure.
But I think he does have his faults when he's talking about this subject. And I think he isolates a lot of the problems of Islam to the theology, what it says in the Quran. You can do that. You can open a Quran and say, let's read this and then analyze what it says. I do that. That's an interesting thing to do. But then he goes into terrorism and the effects of these communities and what's going on.
Yeah.
Then you got to be like, okay, where are they from? Where are they predominantly from? What brand are they of Muslim? It's different to talk if they're Sufis or Shia or Ahmadis or if I said like it's different to say this community is Muslim versus this community is Pakistani Deobandi. Do you know what that means, right? Do you know what that implies? Right. If I said Ahmadi, the Ahmadi community in Pakistan is a offshoot sect of Islam that was only created a little over a century ago. A lot of people actually compare it to Mormonism because it's a recent kind of variation on the religion, and they have their own prophet in Ahmadi Islam, their own prophet of that time, Joseph Smith,
and his name is Joseph Smith, coincidentally.
And Muslims don't consider the Ahmadi to be real Muslims, just like Christians don't consider Mormons to be Christians. Right. So when we just say Muslim, I think that's not really doing justice to the conversation, because this is a very big issue. And if you're just saying Muslim, then you're throwing all these poor Moroccans and Iranians and Tunisians into the mix, and they're like, "What the hell did I do?"
Was this true that the sentiment you always hear about George Bush going into Iraq, that he really didn't know the difference between Sunni and Shia and that kind of thing? And is that it just seems like you would figure that out before you went over there. You know what I mean?
He might have. So he might have gotten a crash course right before, on the plane, right? The problem is I don't know much more that you would really need to understand is these are two sects of Islam and they hate each other. The theology, the deep theology there is not something he really needs to understand. Right. But I mean, the problem is that the Middle East. Look, you get to let's say you got to Iraq, and even let's say I understand the difference between Sunni and Shia. It doesn't matter. You get there, and every tribe has their own kind of little variation on Islam. The tribalism, the area, when they introduce themselves, I'm, Ahmed from this area, from this tribe, from this religion. It's not just Sunni and Shia, but that's a division. But there's also millions of subdivisions. You wouldn't be able to learn that, right? I don't even pretend to even trying to learn that. Tribalism in the Middle East is so over the top still. We had this kind of tribalism in the West at some point. They're still very much retrograde in the past. And we want the whole world to kind of come to the point where the West is, the developed First World War. Not everyone is there. And that takes some patience. But I think the most important aspect is the improvement of education and literacy and access to information. I think actually the most important thing to actually improve the world, and all this talk about reforming Islam is total nonsense. Just chuck that out the window. It doesn't matter. Improve people's economic situation and their access to information. I think the best way to reform any underdeveloped, oppressive society, help them watch movies. Mm-hmm. Honestly, a movie is going to change the world. Before
it's in Korea, they sneak over films like cassettes and stuff. over the border, and some North Koreans end up watching some.
I could tell you, I love to read biographies. I could tell you people, for example, Yeonmi Park, who was an escape refugee from North Korea. One of the things that inspired her of going to the West was watching a pirated version of Titanic, right? And watching a pirated version of Titanic in your home in North Korea could literally be a jail sentence to a concentration camp with your whole family, your brothers, your grandfather, and on the risk of watching that movie. And they do it all together. It's just worth it for them. And I could tell you another story. For example, Manal al-Sharif, a woman from Saudi Arabia. She was very fundamentalist in her practice of Sunni Islam. And one of the things that opened her up to the entire West and the whole world out there was listening to the song from NSYNC, Tell Me the Reason of Being Lonely. And she goes on about it. You know, it's like, what is this? An explosion. A song to us that would mean nothing. We laugh at, you know, what does that song mean to me? It means nothing. To her, it was literally the world opening up to her. A song as like that. So you want to change the world. It's sometimes as simple as creating access to things like YouTube, you know, books, movies, television shows, those kind of, I mean, one of the big things that South Koreans do to help reform the mentality in North Korea is to send DVDs or VHSs, now maybe USB drives with Korean dramas, television dramas to the country, so they see how people live, they see, you know, how they love and how they interact with in politics and you know, their style of life and things like that. That's what changes people.
Yeah, very interesting. Can we jump to this comparison you hear these days with between white supremacy and the violence surrounding that, and then Islamic terrorism? Why is there this, you know, sort of battle between these two seemingly, and comparing them all the time, or one-upping each other? Like, aren't they both problems that should be worked on? And
yeah, it's very sad to see that actually people only care about the supremacy of the other side. That's something that I'm a person who really despises, obviously, as much as anybody else could, white supremacy or the KKK or a Nazi, of course. But there's something kind of extra distasteful and bugs me even a little bit deeper that from a well-meaning liberal white person who kind of praises fascist, sexist, patriarchal religious ideologies because they come from brown people. Right? They romanticize it and they excuse it. And they almost say, like, you'd be better off with it. That has a little extra touch of disgust for me. You know, it's like, you know, I'm a liberal, feminist, progressive, social justice, blah 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 blah. But Islam is love. Islam is peace. It's the most feminist religion in the world, right? That's it for a person who, I don't really consider myself any part of any political party, but I would say mostly I'm liberal on social issues. Very few issues I could identify as not being very liberal. There's a couple. Mostly I don't care about what other people do with their lives, right? Homosexuality or women's
more of
rights.
A libertarian slant, or a little bit?
No, libertarianism is a very American ideal. From what I understand, like the example I always go to with libertarianism is that Republicans are against gay marriage. Liberals are in favor of gay marriage. A libertarian thinks that marriage shouldn't even involve the government at all.
Okay.
Right? Like there should be it shouldn't even be registered under their venue. Right?
Sure.
That's the libertarian. And that's where I actually say, no, I'm not a libertarian. I actually think like the marriage contract and the protections that come where like there's the protection of the wife, there's the protection of the children and things like that.
Or like driver's licenses, stuff like that.
I actually think like the government involvement is actually kind of okay to a degree. So I'm not a libertarian actually, but on principle myself, I don't really care what people do with their lives, right? And also I don't want people getting involved in my life. Where was I going with this? What was I talking about?
We were talking about white supremacy and Islamic terrorism and romanticizing. Right.
So when I see these liberal, well-meaning people romanticize Islam, especially as a person from Palestinian background who's not Muslim, and also not just Muslim and not believing in Islam, but I see the dangers as clearly as I see in Christianity, the Catholic Church, Scientology, Mormonism, evangelical Christianity, Hasidic Judaism, the oppressive nature of all fundamentalist religion. I see it as just as clearly in Islam. And when I see that these liberal people they understand very clearly. If I said to them Mormonism, they're like, oh, Mormonism, crazies, nuts, wearing, magic underwear, very oppressive religion. Evangelical Christianity, George Bush, Michelle Bachmann, oh, crazy people, nuts. Scientology, oh, I love the TV show from Leah Remini. Oh my God, these people, they're such harassers. It's awful. Islam, oh, poor Muslim. Yeah, no, it's great. It's a feminist religion. I'm going to put on a hijab, to support my Muslims. It's like, what are you doing? Mm-hmm. And all I would ask these people is just hold the same standard. If you're going to be against all these other religions in their fundamentalist form, be against Islam. If you're going to tell me, like, you're going to support, like, if they're going to tell me women who wear hijab, I'm not for or against that. I just say it's their choice. Okay, then apply that same rule to every other religion, because I don't see you doing that. I don't see a Sports Illustrated issue with an Amish woman, Orthodox Jewish woman, a Mormon woman, who dresses modestly. There's no celebration of that. There's no support of that. They wouldn't support it.
So is it not pandering? Is it just general pandering from when Nike does it, or when, like, we have local politicians here that do it?
I don't think it's pandering. Because I don't see why a lot of it might be pandering from a politician. It might be pandering from a company who wants to sell products. That could be pandering. But the public, right? The individual, 18-year-old girl in her room who's just, watching this stuff, she's not pandering. What is she doing? I think it's just confusion on their part. Sure. I think that there's a real misunderstanding that Islam is not a race. We say that all the time, but I think people actually believe that. And I'll tell you this, I don't think it's just the left who believes that. I think that even I see right-wingers on Twitter and YouTube saying Islam is not a race and then treat it like a race. Right? And so even you say, oh, I can criticize Islam, it's not a race, but then they say Arab culture is a problem and then they point to Islam. Okay. Whoa. You just said it's not a race. You just distinguished it as specifically a religious practice. But then you're talking about Arabs and Arab culture. Arabs and who have Arab culture, who are Christian, are not doing the things you're talking about. Just like if we talked about Christian, crazy evangelical Christians in the United States, I wouldn't just say like, oh, American culture, right? It's not the culture of everyone. It's not particular to white people by any means. So I think even on the case of people from the right who say Islam is not a race, they are doing it too. I think it's worse with the left. I think that they think that being Muslim is synonymous with being from a lot of these countries in the Middle East. And I think they are abandoning a lot of people who are fighting for their rights. Feminists, religious minorities, racial minorities, who live under a very oppressive theocracy. Doesn't even have to necessarily be a theocracy. It can be just individual communities. And they are totally abandoned by feminist, liberal, progressive movements in the United States. And I know that for an absolute fact. Because I have interviewed people like Masih Alinejad, who's extremely famous Iranian feminist activist who fights for women to not be obligated to wear the hijab in Iran. Mm-hmm. She wrote a book recently, The Wind in My Hair. I interviewed her. She won a Women's Rights Award from the United Nations. Very important person. And I asked her directly, do you get support from feminists? No, they don't. So I don't want people telling me that like, oh no, we support the Muslim feminists too. No, you don't. I know for a fact. I've asked them.
Right.
I look for these people. I go out of my way to find people like Manal al-Sharif, right, who I've spoken to, who wrote the book Daring to Drive. She was one of the main activists to get the right to drive in Saudi Arabia, right? I've talked with Daria Safai, who runs the campaign Let Iranian Women into Their Stadiums, because women in Iran can't enter their stadiums. I know these people. I've spoken with these people. I've recorded some of these on my podcast. They tell me they're not getting the support. Don't tell me they are. They're not. It's very sad that these feminists in the West, they don't support Muslim women. They support the most fundamentalist, crazy Muslim women they can find. They ignore the ones who are not wearing a hijab, who are saying we're feminists. They're looking for the most practicing, the most covered, the ones who are talking about the most modesty, patriarchal culture of Islam. Those are the ones they look for and praise and hold their hands and say, we love you. The more crazy and fundamentalist, the better for them. It's the polar opposite of what they do with any other religion. It infuriates me. And I don't know what to do about it, because it's not like you just tell to explain this in a society where Islam is practically void is a very hard thing to do.
Right. You mean void in America or
most places? I mean, really, how many? Like, there's not even that many Muslims in the UK or even in Europe, depending on where you are. It's not a huge part of the population.
So you mean the perception is that there's more than there actually is?
And the problem is from the perception is that you can't actually interact with a Muslim in the United States, right? There was some study that a lot of people were pointing to, a lot of Muslim apologists were pointing to, that the average American, very tiny percentage that had actually interacted with a Muslim, and they used this to point to racism. That's not racist. That's because there are no Muslims. They're nowhere to be found. They're just not there. What are you talking about? They're less than 1% of the population, and most of that 1% lives in like Dearborn, Michigan, or a very particular place.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
So it's not. It's like you fault them for not interacting with Muslims. They have no opportunity to, right? So
yeah, that's interesting. But that speaks to the whole Nike hijab thing, and it's how much it's mentioned in that kind of thing is, it's some sort of it's a misrepresentation of the reality on the ground. It's even speaking about like trans people, for example, or any of these small minorities that we put so much emphasis on, but it's really a very small percentage of the population. I'm not saying that the problems that exist are not real and need to be addressed, kind of thing, but sometimes you think there's more than there are.
I gotta add though that I don't. The left seems to be ignoring the problems of Islam and minorities and women. The right wing doesn't ignore it. They talk about it a lot, but I don't actually think they care about these populations. I think they only use these problems to say this is why we shouldn't let these people in.
Yes.
They talk about gay people being killed. They talk about women being beaten or acid thrown in their faces. I don't think they actually care about these groups. I think they just use these stories to say, see this, I don't want this in my country. And I know that because I see that every day on Twitter and social media. When I post these stories, because I care about these populations and I want to see these populations improve in their human rights, the comments I get look a lot like from, people who say like have Britain first on their profile, or Trump or something, and then they say, I don't want this in my country, more than they have sympathy for the actual people. And also I've spoken with people, for example, I spoke with a kid named Mohad. I can't remember his name, but he was from Kenya. He was an immigrant from Kenya to the United States. He is homosexual. His parents took him to Kenya to visit family, and they put him into a place where they do conversion therapy for gay people. He escaped. He went back to the U.S. He got freed legally from his parents as an independent individual. And I interviewed him, and he said, I got a lot of interviews asking me to be on Breitbart, InfoWars, whatever, some right-wing shows. He got no invitations to any left-wing shows. So the left-wing ignore him because he's not a beneficial story to them. He doesn't fit the narrative. Yeah. The right-wing wanted to interview him, and he said, I wouldn't do it. He said, I'm not going to go on these shows, because he knows they're just going to use his story to say this is why we shouldn't have people come to our country from there. But he's an immigrant from Africa. The United States, going to the United States saved his life. So he can't do that. So he's between a rock and a hard place. The left wing who wants to talk to you don't care about him, ignore him, which is disgusting. And then the other people just want to use him to push a narrative where they wouldn't let him into the country to begin with, right?
Right.
So what does he do? He can't do anything. He talks to me, some nobody with a small podcast, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't have a lot of listeners. I wish I could get this kid on a big platform, but which big platform? The big left ones don't want to talk to him. The big right ones just want to use him. So I don't know the solution to these problems. It's too big for me.
You say it almost like with some humor, but I do think the podcast world is where a lot of these important conversations are happening, and even with the small ones, because like you've been on Rubin, and Dave Rubin has been on Rogan, and so there's connections between all these shows where the ideas could definitely spread. Even if it's a small podcast, I think for sure.
And I think a lot of these small podcasting in the future is gonna hopefully make things a bit better and improve understanding. Hopefully what podcast will do, which I don't think it's there yet, is that it's created these bubbles where people just live in echo chambers. But my hope is that, everything is a fashion, right? Fashions come and go. And I think at some point it will become fashionable to talk with people from across the table and come to better understandings. Because I think the echo chambers will just fade out from just being boring. I really think that just a lot of extremism dies because it just gets dull.
Yep. Speaking of all this confusion and narratives and such, what do you think about the concept of selective empathy, just basically with news stories like what's going on in Sudan right now, for example, or when the Paris attacks happened, sort of the level of empathy that people have in these short bursts of time, that then other stories get forgotten and that kind of thing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
A lot of people try to interpret that as being racist. It's not racism. It's just what we're familiar with. It's knowing what a country is like, its language, its history. I'm not surprised if people hear a story from South Korea and be like, it's nothing to me, but I've lived there and I have friends there. If there's threats of a nuclear strike in South Korea, I'm thinking about my friends there and families I met, right? Other people don't have that connection. Obviously, when you have connections to a place, it increments, and that's understandable, right? The idea that we all have to have this kind of absolute humanist empathy for everyone equally is kind of nonsense. We don't, right? If we don't establish human connections with each other, that doesn't happen. The internet world kind of created where we're getting in the moment news of horrendous things happening from every corner of the world. Yep. And people are looking at this like, well, why are you paying more attention to a story in France than Somalia? Well, a lot of this population is probably either lives in France or has visited France or knows of France or seen movies of France.
Yes.
Who knows? Somalia, I don't know it. I've never been there. I don't know anybody who's been there. There's no connection, right? Besides the story. You could just say a lot of people just think on a human level, I feel bad, but how bad do you feel? I don't think that's a lack of empathy. I think it's a lack of human connection and lack of understanding. And
or what about, if I could shift it a little bit? Sorry. What about when they say, oh, nobody's covering this, like Sudan has this going on and the media is silent.
Again, that's just clicks. I mean, that's clicks. I mean, if people aren't interested in something, they're not going to post it, right? Like people need to make clicks these days. So if nobody's interested in Somalia, they're not going to cover it. Now, I'm not surprised. Right. So selective empathy, I think, is a kind of a term that makes us sound colder than we are. I don't think that's coldness. I don't think that's racism. I think it's like, if I've spoken to you, I have more empathy for you than somebody I've never spoken to. Yeah. That doesn't make me selectively empathetic. That means I'm empathetic based on my human connection.
Sure. Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? It's a very weird thing to say, like, I lack empathy for the other guy who I'd never spoke to. No. My empathy increments, which is how it should be.
Yeah, somewhat related to that concept is, did you have any thoughts when the Notre Dame tower fire, when that fire happened, and just the various comments and outrage surrounding that? Or did you follow that at all? Or
I did. It was very sad to see how many people immediately started to blame Muslim people when there was no evidence of it.
I didn't even catch that part of it.
I saw a lot of that. I followed it that day. I was seeing it. I was seeing the post.
Yeah.
Ooh, there was out of control amount of people like posting very big names.
I guess because there were other churches that got caught on fire as well, so they were trying to connect the dots or something.
I mean, in that case, you could probably just say, I think it might be arson. But they were blaming specifically Muslims.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I saw
My whole thing with that was the arguments that I had got in was more economic and sort of about why did all these rich people donate so fast to this cause when there's a bunch of causes they could have donated to that would be better. And my whole thing was the whole, sovereign. It's your money. You can do with what you want. And also, there were other stories that people were neglecting.
Going the libertarian on me, huh? Yeah.
But there were other stories of like some Swedish billionaire who donated $1 billion to some climate change initiative, and a couple people shared that, but nowhere near the amount that shared the sentiment. Hey, this was wrong. That this guy these people donated all this money. But I was thinking, well, who's going to have to pay that bill if not donations? Wouldn't because it's not owned by the Catholic Church. It was actually owned by the state of France, I believe. I believe France had taken ownership of that building, so the taxpayer would have had to, somehow pay that. I think, and then that's always the person that they're sort of rooting for is the taxpayer. The whole yellow vest thing and the
very
economy's so
interesting
bad.
Topic that you're bringing up. I don't know. That's a very hard thing that I'd have to think about a lot. Is how people should donate money. Like, should they not just donate it to, for example, a church that was very old, right? Yeah. It's like, how much does that matter? But then, what should they do? The conservation of art or something like that. It's like, well, when there's people dying in the world, should you be doing that? For example, I studied film. That's what I originally studied in UC Santa Barbara. I'm a huge film buff. I love movies. Does it do I like the idea of putting out there that nobody should put money into the conservation of film and old movies? Mm-hmm. Right? I wouldn't say that, but maybe I should be saying that all that money would be better off spent, feeding the children of the world. Right? What? It's just a movie at the end of the day.
But I think of that too, I kept saying to people, like, there are other charities, that exist. There are other people donating money. Just because a lot of money was donated very fast to this thing that you don't think is important does not mean that there's not other initiatives going on simultaneously where things are being helped along. Like, do you know what I'm trying to say? Like, they think it's like there's only this one billionaire that just donated this $1 billion, overnight, and there's no other money flowing around. Like, I mean, there's people trying to help the world every day in varying degrees, and you just got to accept that there's going to be some donations that you don't quite agree with, I guess. I don't know. I do malaria nets. That's my thing. A couple bucks a month after all my bills are paid, and that I do against malaria, because actually that was I forget the gentleman's name, but he's been on Sam Harris, and he wrote a book on the most effective charities, and that was one that he recommended at the top as far as using the most of their capital to actually go to real world situations. So I actually see the country where my nets go, how many nets went to each country, and that kind of thing.
Interestingly, I do give to a few charities, but for example, I like to give to PBS because I find I consume a lot of their documentaries. I find like they do some of the best historical documentaries I've ever found as a person who watches a ridiculous amount of documentaries. Are you
like Ken Burns stuff? Is that?
Well, Ken Burns is part of PBS. He does do his documentaries on there, but they have a lot more than that.
Yeah,
a lot more than that. I mean, sometimes I'll be looking on researching a topic, and I'll look for a lot of documentaries, and most of them don't seem that objective to me. And then I see the PBS documentary, and they're having interviews with the people who were involved in the events, the real historical background, and at least as far as my research goes, it looks like the most objective kind of reporting I'd seen on the topic. So I think to me, for example, PBS is a treasure in the United States. I wish there was a kind of a similar PBS thing in Chile or other countries. I think it's very underappreciated. But that's the kind of thing where I'm saying, like, should I be instead sending that money for malaria? I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, it's a good question, right?
No, it's definitely a good question. I think what it brought up in people is just this growing sentiment about, against rich people and
I
against.
think it was the amount of money that was sent to
Yeah.
to the right on the Notre Dame Cathedral. I think it seemed like kind of an absurd amount of money for an old building. As much as any of us can say we do have appreciation, we wish this could be renovated again.
Yeah.
But when we start talking about like hundreds of millions of dollars for like an old building, and we get into like the billions number, we're like, okay, I think I think this
Yeah,
could
you're
slow
right.
down the destruction. I think that was the issue. I think it was the amount of dollars that we started seeing there build up, and I think at some point maybe it would have helped calm it down if the person receiving the money had said, we got too much, we're probably going to send this to some charity and slow down the construction of Notre Dame, right?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a very interesting area of discussion, though. But that one thing about the guy donating to this climate change initiative did make me think, like, nobody's paying attention to that. And climate change is probably something that affects the impoverished people of the world, which are, again, who these people are always rooting for. So, but again, I guess it speaks to News Digest.
When you were talking about donating to problems that are more immediate to people's lives, you could also ask them there, should you donate to charities that help people immediately or in the long term? For example, should you help starving children, or should you help to climate change, which would cause massive starvation in 50 years to 100 years?
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So
well, and the other thing is a foreign aid thing, right? Like, how do you, and maybe you have some insights on this because you've studied foreign policy and that, like, helping third world nations with just sums of cash. Like, where does that go wrong? Where does it go right? The little bit of reading I've done on it, you see these, these guys building palaces and that in Africa with the money, and so the money not going where it's sort of supposed to go and that kind of thing. I don't know.
There's a very interesting situation I saw, like, it might have been almost 10 years ago this happened. Maybe a little bit less, but around then, there was a mass starvation in Somalia. I might get a few things wrong because this was quite a while. This is a really kind of old story, but I find it fascinating as far as like how aid goes. So there was a very, very big famine going on in Somalia. The United States wanted to send aid. I read stories, for example, of women leaving their babies in huts and just abandoning them because they didn't have the energy to pick up the baby and go somewhere and find food. Right? That's how starved they were. You hear a story like that and you're just like, that is starvation. That's famine. And the United States obviously rightfully wanted to send aid. The problem is that the only organizations that could distribute the aid effectively was Al-Shabaab, which is basically the African equivalent of Al-Qaeda, right? It's a very horrible, fundamentalist, Islamic extremist group that takes child soldiers. But that was the only way. And basically the United States would be empowering Al-Shabaab by giving them the aid, and then they redistribute it to the people. So what do you do there? Do you like help stop a famine that is of epic proportion in this country? Like, if you send some aid, some food aid, you could help possibly save the lives of a few million people.
Yeah.
Or do you not, and you not empower this horrific organization that goes around to villages, kills people, rapes little girls, and takes child soldiers? What would you do? I looked at that situation. I'll never forget it because I looked at that story and I said, "Thank God I'm not a politician. I don't know what I would do here."
No.
Would you empower a group that rapes little girls, or would you empower them and help that starving woman who can't pick up her baby?
Exactly.
I have no idea what I would do then. So it's a lot of people in the world, when they look at global issues happening, for example, in Somalia, and everybody seems to know what the right solution is to every problem. no matter what it is. I see a story pops up and everybody's just like, I know this is what they should do. I'm a liberal. I'm a Republican. Obviously, this is what you should do. When you really know what's going on in a lot of these countries, you don't have the right answer because there is no right answer. There's no right answer in that situation. Anything you pick in that situation, you are essentially committing a horrible crime, no matter what you pick. It's a lose-lose situation.
That's insane, and that's just the real world, I guess. That's the problems that we
and
face
it goes back to
world.
what we were talking about in North Korea. What do you do if this country that is the worst, most oppressive country in the world with concentration camps? Do you go shake their hand and try to prove diplomacy, right? Or do you say that, this is a horrible dictator of epic proportions, and I would never shake his hand? What do you do there? It's not easy answer.
He shook his hand and he gave him 3 elbow taps.
Yeah, well, I mean, especially in Trump's case, he has said things about Kim Jong-un that are just unforgivable to me. The things that
he has great potential, I think, was one of
he says he's a great leader and he does a great job and it's so hard running his country. Things that are not, it goes beyond diplomacy. That's not diplomacy. That's not diplomacy. That's just populism, right? Is that how you say populismo?
Yeah.
You have to remember that I'm speaking in a second language. I don't speak English that often. Populism? Is it populism?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Where like a politician appeals to the popular vote?
Yeah, for sure. Yep.
Okay. All right.
Jumping back, shifting over back to Chile, you had mentioned somewhere else, I didn't know this, that abortion is completely illegal in Chile. Is that still the case? Did they change it?
They changed it. What was it? 4 years ago?
Oh, okay. So what were back then when it was illegal? Where would women go?
Yes. So this is a topic that people get very confused about when I talk about the illegality of abortion. People don't understand what I'm talking about. When I was talking about Chile abortion being illegal, it was illegal in Chile under all circumstances. That's something people don't understand. Like when Chile was. When it was illegal here, it was only part of 6 countries in the whole world where abortion was illegal. But then people said, "Oh, but it's illegal in my country." It's like no. It's like it's only you don't have the optional abortion, but you still have abortion under the conditions of like rape,
health,
the health, like mother's life in danger. I'm talking about countries where in every single circumstance, literally when the mother's life is in danger of dying, like when it like the what you call it? Oh God, this is my English again.
Fetus?
The fetus is in like the fallopian tube, right? Yep. Like it can't be there. It would kill them. Like in those cases, it's illegal. Now, even in Chile, like for example, the situation I just described, they would do it like under the table without kind of putting it on the chart, right?
So it did happen when it was illegal, though. Like
it would happen. But sometimes women couldn't get it done under certain circumstances. Under the cases of rape, there was a story a few years ago of a journalist woman where the fetus was developing under a malformation. It didn't have a heart. It didn't have a brain. There was no development in this child. She had to take it to term. She had to give birth. She wasn't an option. And that I like when you hear stories like that, it's I call it like a lack of respect to women and the burden they bear of having the children. And even in Chile now, there's only certain circumstances where they can get an abortion. For example, rape, incest, mother's life in danger. I think those are the 3. It's still not, optional. It's still not like I just want to have an abortion because it's Thursday kind of thing. But in the United States, for example, there's optional abortion. You can have an abortion because you want to. But an important aspect of that topic that I like to bring up is that every single country where abortion is completely illegal under all circumstances are all Christian majority countries. None of them are Islamic. And that's because the topic of abortion is not really considered haram or prohibited under Islam. That doesn't, and people again get confused. This doesn't mean that Muslims are pro-abortion, right? They're usually against it. but under extreme circumstances, there's nothing theologically that opposes it. Okay, so that is something to take into account, that how theology influences people. To be a religious conservative doesn't mean everybody believes the same thing, because you have to remember, even Saudi Arabia was a hardcore theocracy. Women couldn't drive, but they could get an abortion. Abortion wasn't completely illegal in their country, but it was illegal in Chile, right? Whereas a very secular country. So, in a very well-developed country, very high levels of education, but we couldn't have it here. It's like, so there was less women's rights in some ways in Chile than there was in Saudi. So it's a very good. So what I like to bring up about that is that everybody kind of points to, for example, Sam Harris as well. He likes to point to how theology creates a negative circumstance in a country. I think it's a little bit more easy to digest when you actually bring up how a religion actually creates a good situation in the country versus another. So not just saying like, well, if you study theology, you can understand how it develops terrorism. Why not also say, like, if you study theology, you can understand why no Muslim country in the world, no matter how theocratic, doesn't prohibit abortion. Do you see what I mean? And if you understand that, like, oh, there's actually like an upside. Like every country that prohibits abortion on every level, they're all Christian because it's part of the theology, right? So I think it's an interesting example in that case.
What's the deal with Chile's geographic situation? Is there mountains there? Is that why it's so
The
long
Andes,
and tall?
man.
Yeah. Okay.
Don't you remember the football team?
No,
Did you ever see the movie Alive? The football team that ate each other?
I haven't actually seen it, but yeah, no, I'm familiar. But
yeah.
Yeah, okay,
Big
the
mountains.
yeah,
Big
it's
mountains.
there's no other country that's like looks like that. Japan is like close because it's just long
The
island.
Andes are, I don't know if there's much more, like there's other places maybe in the Himalayas or something, but the Andes are crazy. You fly it over it and it's just mountains and mountains covered in snow.
And they also have a large claim on Antarctica, which other nations do, I guess, of land that like it's not recognized under the treaty. But I didn't really think about that before.
Yeah, Tierra de Fuego.
Yeah,
Tierra de
so
Fuego.
is this
Like,
what old explorers that just planted flags and stuff there, or like?
Yeah, well, it's a very odd thing. I think Chile actually says like they have a claim to like a chunk of Antarctica, but technically it's not. It's not really part of the country. They want it to be part of the country, but I think actually no country actually has like border claim to Antarctica. I don't think it's actually recognized by the United Nations. It's
definitely not recognized. So why was Chile such a home for Palestinians? What was the history there?
Why Chile? Apparently because it was a thriving economy at the time.
Now we're talking World War II era?
No, World War One.
Oh.
Because the reason that Palestinians left Palestine, and remember, this is like Palestine was basically a region of the Ottoman Empire, right? Just like Armenia, right? Armenia was a country, but it was under the Ottoman Empire at that time. You've heard of the Armenian genocide. The Ottoman Empire, when it went into World War One, it started recruiting people, and they forced a lot of Christians into the recruitment, and they would just throw them into the front of the lines with no guns and just kill them. They used also World War One as an excuse to commit the Armenian genocide, and that's why a lot of the Christian populations of a lot of countries left: Lebanon, Syria, Armenia, Palestine, and they came to places like Chile and Latin America, because there was a lot of boom during World War One in Latin America as far as economics. Argentina was a very big economy, and Brazil as well. A lot of people don't know this, but during that time, Argentina was among the top economies in the world. Used to be. Now, obviously not, but there was a very big boom back in those days in Latin America, and so a lot of Palestinians came to Chile. Why specifically Chile? Kind of a mystery. But that is the reason they left, because of persecution.
Okay. So in your recent readings and studying, what are some of the biggest insights you've found about Islamic cultures living in other countries? Anything surprise you or stand out?
Oh, I got great stories for you. Want to hear some of the stories I've heard?
Sure. Okay.
All
Yep.
right. Yeah, this is exclusive. I haven't told anybody this on a podcast yet.
Okay, great.
So for example, I met with a Muslim leader here in Chile, and I don't want to be too specific as to who, because I'm still doing some of this research. But he told me stories. For example, we went into the topic of extremism, which I thought was going to be a very delicate situation to go into, right? Rising extremism in Latin America. I didn't even have to bring it up. He was happy to talk about it immediately. He said he had connections to PDI, which is kind of like the FBI of Chile, police, government officials, because he gets a lot of people coming to his mosque and talking about extremist ideas. They start talking about a lot of politics, instead of religion. The United States invasion of Iraq, Israel, Palestine. They start to sound very fishy about how they speak about these topics. He said he would get three kinds of people wanting to convert to Islam. People who wanted to convert because of the religion, people who were marrying into the religion, and people who were very political. And the political people were the kind of dangerous one that he worried about. So when he got these people coming into his mosque, he would inform, like, kind of police agencies, like, this is maybe somebody you want to watch out for. He seems kind of crazy. I asked him how many of those people he would get in a year. He's like, several a month, which to me is very worrying. Very interesting thing to find out during this research. And then I asked him, well, what do you tell these people? Do you tell them, like, we're not interested in having you? And he said, well, in Islam, it's an obligation of the religion that if somebody wants to learn about Islam, you must share Islam with them. You must help them come into the religion. That's an obligation as a Muslim. So he would say that if a person was coming to convert because of the religion, he would make it kind of hard. He said if they were coming to convert because of marriage, he'd make it less difficult. But he said if these people who are coming, who seemed like very political and weird, kind of extreme, he said, then I just go full Islam on these guys. You gotta do circumcision. You gotta pray 5 times a day immediately. You gotta start practicing fasting. He's like, in 2 weeks, I got these people running out the door. So that was his way of kind of getting these people, like, so that way he completes his obligation as a Muslim, and he can get rid of them, which I thought was a really funny story. That he's like, you want to know Islam? I'll show you Islam.
So right? Scared them away, sort of.
Yeah, them away. So, and it was this topic that really he worried about was extremism. He, that people coming to his mosque and talking these ideas. He's not there for that. He doesn't want these people around, and so it's very interesting to hear from Muslims who run mosques and groups, and they're very worried about extremism. And I think that's one of the things you learn when you actually go out into the world and actually speak with Muslims, which I feel there is some validity to saying put your money where your mouth is. And I did that on my own. I said, I'm talking about this topic of a lot of Islam. I'm very critical of the religion, but I haven't traveled to the Middle East. I haven't gone out of my way to meet Muslims. Why not just contact people around and say, I'd like to speak with you. See what happens. I thought maybe for a second, maybe they were like, no, not interested in talking with you. Maybe. Right. And very clearly I would say, like, I'm not looking to convert. I do research, I talk about this. I want to learn, teach me. Yeah. Very happy to speak to me. Super nice people up until now that I've met. I'm really excited to keep doing a lot more research on it. It's very fun. So, and you're probably going to run into some different kinds of people, right? People, maybe some extreme, some very secular, but I think that's it's an important thing to do. And I'll see what I do with this, right? With this kind of research.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, like, are you going to write a book or do more blogs or another podcast? I
don't know, because I didn't know what to expect from this, if you know what I mean. Like, maybe like everybody tells me to go to hell. I don't want to talk to you. So why plan anything with it? But since it's doing well for now, just keep doing it and see what happens. So but I do my podcast, which is fun, interviewing people who write books and secularists from around the world. It gives me the chance to to talk with people like you are with me now. What I really like is I like to read books. It's a lot of fun that if I read a book and then I just tweeted at the author, will you call me on Skype? I want to talk with you. They'll probably like, this is a weird request, right? But if I said, hey, can I call you on Skype? I have a podcast and I'd like to interview you. Then it's cool. Then they're like fine with it. So it gives me the chance to read a book and then talk with the author who's might be in Iran or Australia or the UK or Canada.
No, I feel the same way.
Yeah.
I did that with the guy who wrote Perfect Soldiers. I got Terry McDermott to come on my show, and like he's not doing any press or anything. He's just sitting like writing about baseball now. And he's like, I don't even really care about terrorism anymore.
Amazing?
But I'll tell you the story. Like
15 years ago, we couldn't have done that. We couldn't just like buy a book, read it, and be like, I'm going to call the author and talk with him for a couple hours.
Honestly, the coolest thing ever.
I absolutely love that. Even if I got 100 listens for every podcast, I'd still be doing it because it's so much fun. I mean, if I get to read a book like Masih Alinejad, who's an Iranian activist that I mentioned before, I read her book. I admire the hell out of her, such admirations, and I tweet at her on social media and I say, can I interview her? No problem. Comes on. I get to speak with her. I think I get like about 9 out of 10 people say yes to me, which amazing. It's absolutely great. That to me, as much as we bitch and whine about Twitter and how horrible social media is, and there's a lot of downsides to that, I have to say that to me is an amazing, incredible part of social media that I get to contact these people and speak to them.
I agree, and it's definitely a double-edged sword. Did you want to touch briefly on, we mentioned before we started recording that there's all these downsides to social media, and you experienced some.
Yeah, I haven't done my podcast in a while. I hope I'm planning on like reviving it in the next few weeks. But I felt I needed to take a break because I started doing social media in 2015. Prior to that, I'm on Goodreads, that kind of social media website for books.
Okay.
And I was reading a ton, and I could see how many books I read. And then suddenly 2015, 16, like 2016, I read like one book.
Yeah.
And I was getting really out of shape. I was a person who liked exercising a lot, doing martial arts and things like that. And I was getting very overweight. And between not reading books, getting overweight, and not moving a lot, being very sedentary. And then what I'm doing while I'm being sedentary is being on my phone, reading mindless, horrible comments, right? Like that are racist and awful and just fighting all the time with social media. It's not a normal thing to just be alone in your room on this device right here and just be fighting with people for years, nonstop all day. It's like, it's horrible. And I don't care who says it's like, oh, I don't care about the haters. No, if you got haters on you like 8 hours a day for 3 years, you're gonna face some depression. You're gonna have some health issues, right? Some stress issues. I almost don't like that people talk about it's the fault of the haters. We need to change the haters, the bullying and all that. It's actually my fault. Mm-hmm. I don't blame I'm putting my opinion out there. I'm putting it out there to millions of people. Yeah. They don't like what they're hearing. Some of them get very upset about it, called me all kind of racist names. Like, it's not that I'm okay with that, but at some point I have to ask myself, how can I keep doing that and excusing it? I got to it's my responsibility to put the phone down and go live my life. Mm-hmm. Right. And when you start building a social media audience, as you might in the future, you got to be very careful to you start to feel obligation to it. Oh, I got to tweet. I got to put out a video. I got to do this. Right. And suddenly you're putting in 5 hours a day besides everything else in your life of work. And suddenly you're not exercising. You're not seeing your friends. And so I read a book on social media addiction called Irresistible. I forget who the author is right now, but the book is called Irresistible. It's a fascinating book with a lot of scientific studies. He talks about the main focus is social media addiction, but he also talks about video game addiction and studies that have been done with animals and monkeys and things like that. For example, in the book, what I thought was fascinating, that there is a rehab center for people who play World of Warcraft. There's a little rehab center, just like there's.
Oh, I believe that.
Yeah, you believe that, but for somebody who doesn't play video games, it was a surprise to me.
Right when you messaged me that you were ready for the podcast, I was literally alt tabbed in a game, finishing up the round. I was like,
so I wasn't. I'm not very into video games, right? So I didn't really face that kind of. I'm not an addictive person, and I don't have an addictive personality. I don't consume drugs. I don't smoke. I drink occasionally. You know, I would exercise a good amount. Social media was actually my first problematic addiction where it was negatively affecting my life and my health. And I took a full month off, no social media whatsoever, deleted the apps from my phone, read the book, and it changed a lot. Started, exercising a lot more, starting to go to a CrossFit school close to my house.
Very cool.
Trying to get back into contact with some old friends and really bring down my social media use.
Yeah.
I think I can balance it. I think for a lot of people I've seen online who are addicts, it might be the case that some people need to completely delete social media.
That's interesting. Did you hear that maybe it was last year, Sam Harris had a guy on that it was actually he was one of the early software engineers at, I don't know if it was LinkedIn or one of those, but he's completely off social media, and he's one of the guys who invented these algorithms and such, and he's
that is very
against
typical.
It.
That's very typical. Actually, in the beginning of the book I just mentioned, Irresistible, it talks about it. He interviews or finds out through stories of multiple like big social media CEOs and founders, even Steve Jobs, for example. He found some interview with Steve Jobs where he said he presented the iPad as some like big revolutionary thing that even a baby can use. But then in another interview, he said, I would never let my 14-year-old daughter or niece use it, right? Because they design these things, everything, the phone itself, the tablet, the computer, the apps, the games, it's all designed for addiction. It's not designed for you to use it sometimes. It's designed for you to use it all the time, nonstop.
One of the things is on Twitter they used, I don't know if it was Facebook as well, but there was one thing where the delay of your little red notification of the numbers was not a lag thing from your internet. That was like put in there. It was programmed in to have a slight delay for whatever psychological reason. Some studied reasoning behind that gives you more of a dopamine hit or whatever.
Have you noticed that Facebook and Twitter now, if you're not getting a notification, starts to say you might be interested in this post?
I haven't specifically, but
in Twitter, for example, it's a little purple star. That's not something that you're subscribed to. It's something that you might be interested in.
Right.
So it's sending you notifications that come look at me, even if it's something you don't purposely follow. So it's, again, look at me, come to Twitter, come to Facebook. So
some of them are worse than others as well. I think like Facebook. Well,
obviously
is really bad
the Uber app is not meant for you to stay looking at it all day, obviously, right? But the social media apps like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and a lot of other ones are meant to keep you stuck. And that happened to me very hard with Twitter, I think. Mm-hmm. And it happens to a lot of people with Facebook, Twitter, Instagram.
I'm one of those people who use the excuse of, well, for my business, I need to, because I'm a DJ and I'm a graphic designer, so I use these platforms to promote my stuff, which is true, but that can become an excuse to be on it all the time. But I think it's also a little bit of just, I don't know if this book talks about this, but having self-awareness and being in the moment and being very present, because when you're on these apps, you need to, don't just be, asleep basically in zombie mode. You got to be aware, like, okay, ask yourself, what am I doing on Facebook right now? Why am I looking at this? Because you're just scrolling and it's your cousin's kid's birthday party, and then it's this guy ranting about politics. It's like, is that stuff useful, right? And another thing is one that I'm kind of addicted to is Reddit. And that's more of, I think, a gray area where it's not quite a social media app, but there is aspects of social media involved in it. Like there's accounts and private messaging and posting, but I think you can get a lot of benefit from reading stuff on Reddit, especially just other people's perspectives, or like I do a lot of personal finance reading on there, like comparing my situations, to others, like stuff like that. That again, it could be a dangerous thing because you're convincing yourself that it's useful, but maybe there is some useful stuff there. I don't know.
I don't know how useful actually social media is. I think of the overwhelming majority of it is a lot of like reality show drama. It's like like the Jersey Shore of of the electronic world, right?
Yeah.
I think that like a lot of what I see on YouTube and Twitter and Facebook is actually not very useful.
Totally.
A lot of people ask me like, have you seen this video? Which is a video from a person who made a video about a YouTuber who's anti-social justice, and he made a video about a woman who is pro-social justice, and her video was about, you know, some politician who is right wing, and it's just like, whoa, it's like what I call outrage inception, right? Where you keep falling into these levels of outrage. It's like, I'm outraged about the outrage, and this person's outraged about the outrage about the outrage. And it just becomes like, what am I looking at? I literally saw a video that the person in the YouTube video was analyzing a video that was about a person analyzing a video that was about a person analyzing a video. God. And it was, you know, the point of the video didn't matter. It was that aspect of it. I was fascinated. I'm like, it was like I said, it was like an outrage inception. Like, what am I looking at?
That could be a
like,
good name for a book or a podcast. Outrage inception. But.
Yeah, well, that would be a good book. I also think if we're talking about social media, a lot of the people who talk about social justice and outrage culture and a lot of these aspects, I don't necessarily agree after all these years of kind of, you know, seeing the problems of this outrage culture and people who are into identity politics. I see a lot of the people who are against this kind of fringe left-wing mentality as focusing on the individuals instead of the institutions that enable them. So what I mean by that is people think that crazy social justice warriors, radical feminists are a new thing. They're not. They've always been around. Millennials think like they invented this stuff, right? It's just, oh, in the last 5 years, suddenly we have crazy left-wing radicals. There's always been left-wing radicals. They were go to university and anywhere and ask people who were there 100 years ago, right? 90-year-old man, were there left-wing radicals in your school? Of course there were. What's the difference? What changed really? Well, that left-wing radical was probably him and a group of 5 friends with banners on their campus grounds yelling their heads off. Mm-hmm. Now they have a phone, and that phone allows them to write a very short tweet about my professor said something sexist, right?
Yeah.
That triggered me. And that can get 10,000 retweets. And that's just the retweets. It's seen by tens of thousands more. And that person, the tweet and that person might end up on CNN. So it's distributed now to millions. And the university freaks out because one student with crazy ideas said something on social media within a span of 5 seconds. And now there's because the institution is so scared, they fire the professor. This dynamic, this power dynamic where the student can get the teacher fired didn't exist before. Right? Of course, like they could complain to the school if he said something really horrible.
And you're saying that's based on social media and
that didn't exist.
Yeah.
When I was in university in Santa Barbara in 2005, this wasn't a thing. I was on Facebook when you had to have a university email to get on, right? Like this wasn't a thing yet, right? Yeah. So what I always say is like when I was in school, we were scared of our teachers. Now I'm like, it's very common to see. I see teachers are scared of their students because the students have power, and it's not a power over the dean and the school. It's a social power they have through this medium where they can gain mobs that are outside the realm of the school, right? It's like, and imagine like they can gain a voice through the retweeting of people who like that person might be in California, but the people commenting might be in Japan and Syria and Canada and the UK and Chile or something like that, right? People have nothing to do with the subject. And that power leads to the firing of the teacher through a social justice kind of expulsion. So what I think needs to change is you're not going to change the fact that there are radical people in a school. There's always going to be radical people in a school. The next generation, they're going to find a few more radical. It doesn't take a lot. It takes one moron to do this, right? The problem is the mob that forms around it, and then the response by the institution. So what the institution needs to do is like, we're not scared of social media mobs. We're a school. Why do we care of one tweet that went viral? That's not their job. But the problem is these are old people who didn't grow up with an iPhone, right? I didn't grow. I mean, like I'm talking about people who are like 70 years old. I'm almost 40. I didn't grow up with an iPhone. I didn't have a cell phone until I was 20, and even then it wasn't an iPhone, right?
Same.
So
yeah.
Right. So these are very new things. In the book I read before, it made a very good point. The only people who were born with iPhones and tablets in this moment, the people who are born with it are about 14 years old. So we don't know the effects of a full-grown adult who is born with a smartphone and tablet. We don't know what they look like yet. We don't know what that world looks like yet.
Well, you mentioned the 90s, and I'm 31, so we're not too far apart in age. But
So
I was from the 90s as well, and our peers, we always bring this up as like, don't you just want to go back to the 90s? I mean, I guess everybody has that thing, but it's because we were on that cusp of riding your bikes to your friend's house, knocking on their door to hang out, and then we all got cell phones and then the social media and everything. So we've seen both sides, and there's just something about that time period where things were just a little slower, a little more disconnected, and you just had more space, and it was just something. It's not
that it's more disconnected; it's that we were more connected in person versus being more connected through like the social media medium or a smartphone medium.
Yes.
Right. Or the fact that, for example, that we used to call each other instead of text each other.
Yep.
Right. It's even if we're talking through the phone, there's a little bit more intimacy through the voice. Right. Versus just a text.
Texts and all that are always misinterpreted. The tone is, when you're trying to say something, they interpret it as something else. And so.
That happens to me a lot. Yeah. Because you find some sarcasm or something in your head.
Yeah.
That you think interprets into. But I mean, aside, like, so we talked about the bad stuff, but going back again, I mean, there's great things to social media. Like we said, in the 90s, I wouldn't be able to read a book and then interview the author from my home. Right. And put it online like a show, like a podcast. Yep. So that's a great thing, but there are horrible things. But the important aspect is to find balance in your life and remember, not to be all consumed by social media and your phone. And
totally
exercise is so important. I'm a person who's so advocate like exercise, just like I hear Joe Rogan talk about a lot. I completely agree with that. I don't agree with any kind of body positive movement that doesn't explicitly endorse good diet and exercise. It's not about looks. It doesn't matter if you look great or not. Just exercise, eat right. If you don't do that, everything is going to be worse. Stress, depression, the energy you have throughout your life, it's going to be worse. Do some kind of exercise. Do some kind of healthy eating.
Totally, I agree. Yeah. Sort of my last quick question is you do a lot of reading and such, but what do you have a general like a news diet of sorts, or any particular podcasts or news sources that you go to, or you just sort of mix of everything?
I actually kind of gave up on news. I found myself like I went from books in 2014 and before to kind of being more involved in social media. And social media atmosphere is very like a watchdog kind of mentality of all consuming everyday news, right? Every news story and what's trending and things like that. But that is very time consuming, and it's not, and I found it to be not very educational. And one of the things I realized is if I really want to get through a book within a week or two, there's certain things I need to cut out. Like there's certain things I can't do. For example, I don't follow sports. Right. I wish I could watch UFC, for example, because I practice martial arts, but it's one of those things where it's like, I need to cut out some things from my life. And so like, okay, I do prioritize like work, some social life, exercise, and I need time to read books, and I like watching movies. I can't do everything in the week. What can I do? Right. And as far as like, okay, in the intellectual aspect, what am I going to read? And between a book and following the news all the time, I said, okay, I prefer books. I feel more fulfilled when I pick a topic, let's say about Iran. I want to learn about Iran this week. I read 2 books on it in the month versus just, nitpicking little stories here and there. I don't think a person who just reads news articles and opinion stories is actually educated on world topics. You get a very, very superficial understanding of everything. Like the jack of all trades kind of aspect. Master of none. You know very little about everything. Therefore, you know nothing very well.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah. So to me, I rather know a very few things, but very well.
Yeah.
And this is a philosophy that I've heard a million times in martial arts as well. It's like it's better to concentrate on one form of fighting than like nitpicking not nitpicking. That's the wrong word. Like picking at little bits of all kind of martial arts. You want to be a boxer, be a great boxer. You want to be a kickboxer, jiu-jitsu guy, focus on that one thing, master it. Right. And I think that goes for intellectualism as well. Better to pick a few topics, master it. That's why when you ask me certain things about about immigration in the United States, I'm very quick. I'm like, I don't know about that. Haven't followed it, but I can tell you what I do know and where I can contribute and where I focus myself. The rest is like, and I see a lot of these people online that because there's this culture of wanting to be all consuming of little bits of stories everywhere, they're social media personalities who comment on every story, no matter how little they know about it. Right?
Yeah.
And I actually have a term for this. I call it prophetic information seeking, where you are interested, like there's something happening with Trump. There's something happening with North Korea. There's something happening with Iran. There's something happening with social justice. People don't go to experts on topics. They go to the same person they respect all the time. For example, a very famous person is like Jordan Peterson. People want to know, like, oh, what does Jordan Peterson think about North Korea? Even though he knows nothing about it.
Right.
But he might still comment on it because so many people want to know what he thinks about it. Prophetic information seeking, right? And my philosophy is like, if something is happening in Egypt, I want to know what an Egyptian expert who's written books on this is saying. People don't do that. They don't go to experts. They go to one guy that is like their guru.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I try to stay away from that internet kind of culture, social media culture. I look for books. I look for authors to read about. Yeah.
I think I'm maybe a mix of both types, but I think I'd like to move closer to that style of just getting more into.
You'll find it more fulfilling to read a book. I do. When I finish the book, for example, when I got really into like a news watchdogness in 2015 and 16, and I had stopped reading books, suddenly I'd kind of missed books and read one. And when I finished that book, I was like, I feel more fulfilled about learning about this topic from this one book than 2 years of social media news reading. If you had asked me about any of the topics I'd written news stories on in the last 2 years, I'd be able to tell you like practically nothing on them.
Yeah.
But on this topic, and like suddenly I became a small expert. Right. I think you can kind of almost become a semi-expert if you read 3 books to 5. I think if you read 8 to 10 books on one topic, you can pretty much express yourself to be an expert.
That's
like for example,
that's not too many.
I've read enough books on North Korea, for example, that I'm confident to say I'm an expert on it. Right. There's other books I've read. For example, social media addiction. I read 1 book. I know quite a bit now. Am I an expert? By no means. Right.
Yeah. That one, if you're interested, that I read was 10 reasons to delete your social media accounts right now. And it's
the good thing about the book I read is that it wasn't kind of a self-help lifestyle book.
Yeah.
It was more of an investigation into addiction, which was very interesting. So I don't know what kind of book you read, but the one I read was more oriented towards like scientific research on addiction on social media.
This one touched on it a little bit, but it was more varied in the reasonings as well, like more like repercussions in the real world and stuff like that. This is Jaron Lanier was the guy's name. Anyway, if people are interested. And the one you read was called.
Let me see. The one I read was Irresistible. Adam Alter.
Okay, cool. Yeah, if people want to check those out. Okay, man. Well, we did like 2 hours. It's been fun. I want to thank you again for being a guest. And where can people find you? They can go to your Twitter. You may not be as active as you used to be, but
Everything is Lalo Dagach. Lalo Dagach podcast, Lalo Dagach on Twitter, Lalo Dagach on Facebook. And my podcast is on iTunes and podcast mediums. It's on SoundCloud and YouTube as well. I rarely use video though, so it's YouTube is probably not very practical. But I will start doing it soon again. And I interview a lot of authors, a lot of activists from around the world. I already did an interview that I'll probably put up kind of soon with the author of a book about Heaven's Gate.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I just finished a podcast on that. Forget what that one's called.
There was a short podcast on that. Yeah,
it was a good one. Those Nikes, those black Nikes.
Yeah.
Okay, man. Again, thanks so much, and all the best, and hopefully we'll hear some new content from you soon.
Thank you.
Okay, take care, man.